In this program, we'll introduce you to the table saw. We'll describe all the components and controls and how they affect what operations can be performed on this saw. We've included some helpful safety information and a few demonstrations to show how you can get accurate and consistent results from this versatile woodshop tool. To help you get the most from your table saw, we'll also cover some accessory tools and jigs that make the table saw more versatile and safe to operate. The table saw is a stationary circular saw used for a variety of cuts. Motor-driven table saws have one or more drive belts that transfer power to the blade through pulleys and shafts. Motorized table saws have the saw blade mounted directly to the motor. Now, because of their design, some motorized saws tend to run a bit louder than motor-driven models. Table saws are usually used for ripping and for various cutoff operations. Rip cuts can be performed with a fence, cross cuts with a miter gauge, and various dado cuts with a set of dado blades. Now, by using other guides and accessories, many specialty cuts can be made, such as circular cuts or mortise and tenons. You can even turn the table saw into a sander or shaper. Some saws have a sliding table, which is nice for cutting large or awkward pieces of material. To get an angled cut, table saws either tilt the table top or the arbor assembly where the blade is mounted. Tilting table saws allow the operator to place the stock on a tilted tabletop to get angled cuts. Tilting arbor saws allow the saw blade to be positioned on an angle. Now, each has its own advantages, but the tilting arbor saw is more common in shops today. In this program, we will normally refer to this design. Table saws are often the workhorse of the shop. They're usually mounted permanently in the middle of the workshop with in-feed and out-feed tables to support larger pieces of stock. Now, some are mounted on locking wheels so they can be moved aside when they're not needed. Every woodworker, from cabinet makers to home hobbyists, seem to rely on the table saw for the bulk of their cutting operations. And with the latest generation of light-duty and portable table saws, it's now possible for construction workers to move a table saw to the work site. The table saw is a deceptively dangerous tool when used carelessly or when it's not properly adjusted and set up. The blade spins at great speeds and is sometimes exposed during operations. Because there's so much torque force, table saws have a reputation for throwing even large pieces of wood across the shop when a novice operator tries to force feed them. Although this should never happen to you if you follow a few simple safety rules, safety is extremely important. We will cover more on this later. Let's take a few minutes to get familiar with all the parts and controls of the table saw. The base is usually a metal structure or heavy wooden cabinet, sometimes with a clean-out door for collecting and removing sawdust. This base supports the table. The motor is mounted internally for motorized table saws, or it's mounted on an external shaft to the rear of motor-driven table saws and connected to the arbor through one or more drive belts. Some table saws have a motor cover or box installed to protect the motor from dust and debris. The on-off switch is mounted in a convenient location. Most table saws have a locking switch with a removable key to prevent unauthorized or accidental operation of the saw. The on button is usually surrounded by a protective shield so that it can be pressed only from directly in front of the saw. The off button protrudes out from the surface, and this makes it easy to stop the saw quickly from any angle or in an emergency situation. Continuous use of the table saw may trip the overload protection system, and this can also happen when the saw motor is overloaded or jammed. The reset button is used to reset the system and begin operations again, but be sure to let the motor cool down sufficiently and take precautions to prevent the problem from occurring again. The saw blade is mounted to the arbor assembly and extends up through the throat plate. Most shops have different throat plates for different operations. The blade is mounted on the arbor shaft and held in place with the arbor nut. The arbor nut is reverse threaded so that it will not work free during use. Most saws have some sort of blade stabilizer plates or washers, which are removed in certain circumstances. The blade elevation wheel is used to lower or raise the blade for various depth cuts. blade tilt wheel is used to control the angle of the blade. Both of these controls have locking levers or knobs which will secure the blade in a selected position. Scales are often provided for indicating the angle of the saw. Now be sure to check the angle carefully and don't rely on the scales for making precise cuts of valuable stock. The guard is a safety feature that protects the user from the blade. Guards are either a clear plastic hood or a metal shroud that pivots up to allow the stock to pass by. A splitter device is often built into the guard to keep the stock from closing up on the kerf and binding against the saw blade. The guard also has anti-kickback pawls with one-direction gripper teeth to prevent kickback of stock. Although guards may seem awkward at times, get in the habit of using them. The fence is a straight-edged guide running parallel to the saw blade. The fence mounts on tracks or rails and is used to control stock that's being ripped. As the fence is moved along the rails, the width of the material that's being cut can be adjusted. The fence clamp handle is used to lock the fence into the selected position. Many fences have a knob for making fine adjustments to that position. The fence is a component that can take on many different forms. Many add-on fence packages offer a wider range of widths and more precise positioning systems than the fence that comes standard with a saw. And many operators come up with their own custom-made accessories and tools for making the fence perform specific chores. In most shops, the table saw is located in the middle of the room to allow for handling large pieces of stock. By building tables or benches around the saw and by installing wider fence systems, you can increase your ability to cut large material safely. Most table saws have two miter slots cut into the top of the table, one on either side of the saw blade running precisely parallel to the blade. These slots accept various guide mechanisms such as the miter gauge. Stock is held or clamped against the gauge and slid along the slot and past the saw blade for cutting. The miter gauge is used for cross-cutting stock and for making precise miter cuts. But these slots can be used to guide many other devices such as running boards and tenoning jigs. We'll cover this in more detail later on. Table saws are usually classified by their size, which is a combination of the blade size and the horsepower rating. You should become familiar with a particular model in your shop, and especially the saw's capacity for performing different cuts in different materials. Most wood shops have table saws with blade sizes of 10 to 12 inches and with power ratings of 2 to 4 horsepower. This translates to approximately 10 to 15 amps for 110-volt motors. Sizes can vary from 7 1/4 inch blades up to industrial units with 22-inch blades or even larger. Three more components for determining the size and capability of the table saw are the maximum depth of cut and maximum width of a rip cut and the maximum width of a cross cut. The maximum depth of cut, or maximum thickness of stock that can be cut in one pass, ranges from 2 to 3 inches. Now, a very deep cut may have to be made in several passes. The maximum width of a rip cut is determined by the width of the fence system. Stock fences allow cuts ranging from 12 to 25 inches, but some fence systems can allow 48 inches or more. Wide fence systems are especially handy for cutting paneling. The distance between the front edge of the table and the blade will determine largest stock that can be properly held by the miter gauge and fed into the saw blade. This is the maximum width of a crosscut. It will take practice to become familiar with the saw's ability to cut stocks in various widths and thicknesses. Use extreme caution and proceed slowly until you gain this practical knowledge. And by all means, ask for help when feeding large or heavy pieces of stock. Table saws use the same basic circular saw blades that are used on radial arm saws. Most shops have an assortment of blades, including a rip blade, a crosscut blade, a general-purpose combination blade, and a set of dado blades. Carbide-tipped blades stay sharp longest and give the best all-around performance. Use sharp and true blades and match the blade to the job. Inspect the teeth closely before each use and test for sharpness by dragging your fingernail across the edge of the tooth. If a thin chip of your nail peels off easily, the blade is sharp. Keep your blades clean. A blade that is covered with pitch will slow down the saw and cause binding problems. Be sure the arbor size of the blade matches the saw. Blades are easily damaged and dulled, so store them properly. Since the table saw is often used for a variety of ripping and cross-cutting procedures, a carbide-tipped combination blade is used the most. It's difficult to feed stock along a truly straight path, so the set of the saw teeth is generally a little larger for blades used on a table saw. Now, this is particularly a problem when long pieces of stock or paneling are ripped. The splitter will help prevent binding, but wide-set teeth will help clear a path for the blade. This cutoff blade has many more teeth with a special planer tooth pattern, which means it'll give cuts so smooth they appear to have been planed. This plywood blade has many fine teeth and very little set. This will give a very smooth cut, but can bind up and dull easily if used on materials other than plywood. And this rip blade has deep-cut gullets and large teeth with large hook angles. Dado blade sets consist of two combination-type blades and a set of chipper blades of various thickness. By using the two outer blades and at least one chipper blade, the width of the dado cut can be precisely selected. To make fine adjustments to the width of the cut, you can use paper shims. Another type of dado blade is the adjustable dado cutter head, which is rotated for various thickness settings. This blade will cause a little bit more vibration during cutting. But for light-duty operations, the adjustable dado is adequate and a bit easier to set up. We'll give you a more detailed explanation of how to use dado blades later. Push sticks are one of the most useful tools for cutting on the table saw. Push sticks are used to push stock through the blade of the table saw. Sometimes two are used together. Every shop should have several, and they should be stored so that they're always handy. There are two benefits gained from using push sticks. You have much better control of the wood, and you keep your fingers away from the blade. You also can cut narrow or thin materials, which you couldn't even attempt by hand. When they become damaged, throw them away so you won't be tempted to use them. There are many designs for push sticks, and because they're usually shop-built items, woodworkers often custom design them to best suit their own needs. Push sticks are not a good project for the table saw. Because you have to hold them in your hands, push sticks usually have curved shapes, and they have a notch or groove that's placed against the stock. These curves and notches are more easily cut on a bandsaw, scroll saw, or even a saber saw. Plywood is a good material, although a close-grained wood is okay for the simpler push sticks. Take the time to smooth all edges and corners. Feather boards are another indispensable tool for cutting on the table saw. Feather boards are made from a solid piece of stock that has a series of kerfs cut at one end and equidistant from each other and in line with the grain. This produces a spring-like action when they're clamped against stock on the table. Feather boards are used to hold stock against the fence for ripping or to hold stock against the table. They help to get more accurate cuts, but more importantly, they help to eliminate kickbacks. The feather board is a good first project for the table saw. A shooting board or table is a tool for improving the accuracy of various cross-cutting operations. A shooting board is used instead of a miter gauge for holding stock as it's guided across the table. Each shooting board is built for a specific angle of cut. A 90-degree shooting board is the most common, but it can be handy to have ones for other angles since they're not adjustable. The base of the shooting board is made from a thin piece of plywood or some other sheet material. Mounted to the bottom of this board are two runners carefully placed to line up with the miter slots in the tabletop. A vertical stop board is mounted across the back edge. The stock is held firmly against this stop board while the shooting board is pushed over the saw. A shooting board is an intermediate level project to build, but not beyond most novice woodworkers. Just remember, if it's not precisely accurate, every cut you make with it will also be off. There are many more tools and accessories that come in handy when operating a table saw. A dead man or support device is very useful for supporting long pieces of stock as they come off the table. Extra throat plates are custom matched to specific blades. Miter gauges with extra strips of wood attached can give greater control over stock material during cross-cutting operations. A safe and well-organized wood shop has all its tools and accessories stored in a convenient location so that there's no excuse for not using them. All of the general safety rules for working in a wood shop hold true for operating the table saw. Wear the proper clothing and protective gear. The table saw can throw dust and scrap material up in your face, so the use of protective eye gear is especially important. Work in a well-lit area and support the work properly. Proper support is especially important on the outfeed side of the saw. Always make sure the power is disconnected or the on-off safety key is removed before changing blades or making adjustments to the saw. Power cords and extension cables should be carefully selected to match the amperage rating of the saw. Undersized electrical cords can rob the saw of its power and shorten the life of the motor. Keep the floor around the saw swept clean and free of oil or other hazards. You'll need good traction to push stock through the saw. Do not try to carry on a conversation while you're setting up or operating the table saw. Do not let yourself get distracted. If your friends refuse to respect your need for concentration, ask them to leave the area. It's your safety and health that are at risk. Here are a few additional safety rules to keep in mind when you're using a table saw. Keep the guard and splitter in place. The blade on a table saw is partially exposed, so the first rule is to always keep the guard in place whenever it's possible. The splitter and anti-kickback pawls will help to prevent binding and kickbacks, so use all guards. Use the proper blade for each job. Select the proper blade for the work to be done, and in most cases, a combination blade will be adequate for all cross-cutting operations. Use rip blades when you're ripping with a grain of the wood. The blade should be sharp, true, and clean for best results. Only use blades with proper set teeth to prevent binding or kickbacks. It's very dangerous to use a dull or insufficiently set blade. Check the blade to ensure it revolves freely and make sure the arbor nut is properly tightened. Adjust the height and angle before each operation. Adjust the saw height and angle properly depending on the project. Don't assume the last person left the saw set up for your needs. For most operations, the blade should project above the stock no more than 1/8 inch. This will help to prevent kickback and injuries from the blade. Secure all clamps and locks. Be sure all clamps and locking devices are tightly set and properly positioned before you begin cutting operations. Do not try to make any adjustments to your setup while the saw is running. Use the fence and miter gauge properly. Never try to cut without the fence, the miter gauge, or a jig to guide the stock. Use the miter gauge or a shooter board for cross-cut operations. Use the fence for ripping stock. Never use the fence and miter gauge at the same time for cross-cutting because this can cause a kickback. Use a clearance block mounted at the front of the fence to step off stock during repetitive cross-cutting operations. Never cut stock freehand. Inspect your stock. Inspect your stock carefully before cutting it on the table saw. All stock should have a straight and true edge, and the stock should lie flat on the table. You should not use the table saw to cut stock that has rough or uneven faces. Wood that's warped, cupped, or twisted can cause kickbacks. Do not cut small pieces that force you to put your hands inside the safety margin of 4 inches. The table saw is not the right tool for these cuts. Position yourself properly. It's very important to position yourself properly when using the table saw. In most cases, you should stand to the right of the path of the blade. Now, if there is a kickback, the stock will generally travel in line with the blade. So do not let any other person stand in line with the saw blade either. Wear the proper clothing. Roll up your sleeves or wear a tight-fitting shop coat. Never wear loose jewelry. long hair that is not pinned back, neckties, or anything that might get caught in the saw. Eye protection and hearing protection are required. Maintain a 4-inch safety margin. Maintain at least a 4-inch margin of safety around the saw blade. Keep your fingers at least 4 inches away from the saw at all times. This margin should give you the ability to react to emergency situations before you lose any fingers. Use push sticks or other devices so that you can not make contact with the blade. Make sure the blade is clear before starting the saw. Make sure the blade is clear before you start up the saw. All tools and wood should be removed from the tabletop. Vibration can cause them to move and become safety hazards. Once the table is clear, start the saw and let it come up to full speed before you begin to cut. Anticipate and prevent kickbacks. Table saws have a tendency to throw the stock back at you when the blade binds or jams. This is called kickback. Kickbacks usually occur when the stock gets pinched or jammed between the saw blade and the guide. Dull blades or improperly fed stock, cutting wood with knots or paint, these are all possible causes for kickbacks. Always keep your body away from the rotating blade. Do not reach over the saw blade to remove stock. Have a helper or tail person assist in handling large or long pieces of stock. Use pusher sticks and feather boards to control the stock. This will allow you to keep your hands away from the blade and still control the stock properly. When the cut has been made, push the stock well clear of the blade and then turn the power off. Never release control of the stock while it's in contact with the blade. This, too, can cause kickbacks. Allow the blade to come to a complete stop before removing scrap or making any additional saw adjustments. Never leave the saw while it's running. Never leave the machine before the blade has come to a complete stop. Maintain a clean work area. Keep the table clean and free of excess dust or scrap. But always wait until after the blade has stopped moving to remove waste and sawdust. Lower the blade when you're done. After you've finished the cutting operation and have cleaned up the debris, lower the blade so it will not get damaged. One final note about safety: think carefully about the job. Stop if you have any doubts and ask for help. Most injuries occur after the operator has ignored a premonition or bad feeling about the operation. In this section of the program, we'll demonstrate a few of the more common operating procedures for cutting with a table saw. We'll cover rip cuts, cross cuts, including miter cuts and bevel cuts, and finally, we will cover simple dado cuts. When you rip on the table saw, the fence is used to guide the material through the saw. Start by checking to see that the power is turned off to the saw. Select and mount the proper blade. Use the blade elevation wheel to raise the blade to 1/8 inch above the top of the stock to be ripped. Lock the elevation wheel in place and check the tilt position of the blade and lock it as well. Move the fence to the desired position. Measure from the fence to the blade using a tooth which is set towards the fence. When it's in place, tighten the fence lever. Double check the distance between the fence to the saw blade. You may want to check to see that the fence is parallel to the blade by measuring to the miter slots. Now, if the table saw is properly adjusted by the shop supervisor, the blade will be parallel to the miter slots. Use the guard system. Use a feather board to help keep the stock positioned properly and to prevent kickbacks. Inspect your stock to be sure it has a straight edge and flat surface against the table. Prepare yourself with the proper safety gear and tools. Place the stock on the table but away from the blade and stand to the right of the blade. Have your assistant prepared to receive the stock on the other side of the table. Secure approval of your supervisor or instructor before continuing. Start the saw and wait for it to come up to full speed. Make sure the stock is held firmly against the fence. Now remember to maintain a 4-inch safety zone. If the width you're ripping is less than 5 inches, you should use a push stick. Begin to slowly feed the stock into the blade. Push the stock clear of the far side of the blade. The assistant should only prevent the stock from falling. He should never pull on the stock or help to guide it. This can cause binding and risk of serious injury. It's the operator's responsibility to tell the assistant what he is to do. If you ever feel the blade bind up or begin to jam, hold the stock firmly and immediately turn the saw off. Wait for the saw to come to a complete stop. Do not attempt to pull the stock back or off the blade. This will surely cause a kickback. When the cut is done, turn off the motor and stay with the saw until it stops. Check your work and clean up the area. Lower the saw blade and put your tools away. To make a crosscut on the table saw, you'll have to move the fence out of the way. Never use the fence as a stop while making a crosscut. All crosscuts require the use of a miter gauge or shooting board to control the stock during the cut. Never cut freehand on the table saw, even if the cut doesn't have to be accurate. After you have mounted the proper crosscut blade, get the guard into position. Clamp the stock against the miter gauge or hold it in position and do a test slide in the slot to be sure it glides freely. Turn the motor on and wait for the blade to come up to speed. Slowly push the stock through the blade and past it. Maintain the 4-inch safety zone, of course. Turn the saw off and wait for it to stop. Check the cut and clean up the area. To make a miter crosscut, follow the same basic steps for any crosscut, except you'll have to set the angle position for the miter gauge. When you change the position of the miter gauge, you may want to cut a piece of scrap first to check the angle before you cut valuable stock. Remember to maintain the proper safety margin while you make the cut. To make a bevel crosscut, loosen the blade tilt wheel and position the blade at the proper angle in relation to the tabletop. Tighten the lever, position the guard and place the stock against the miter gauge. Observe all safety precautions and cut the stock. The feed speed will be slower for any bevel cut. It's also possible to rip a long piece of stock while the blade is tilted. Be sure the blade is clear of the fence before you start the cut. Because the blade is in contact with more of your stock, you have to be extra careful to avoid binding and kickbacks. The table saw can be used for cutting rabbets or dados for doing joinery work and cabinet making. We gave you a brief introduction to the two types of dado blades earlier. To set up dados of various widths, you can either stack up separate dado blade assemblies, or you can use an adjustable blade, which is sometimes called a wobble dado blade. Be sure the power is disconnected before changing or adjusting blades. If you use separate dado blades, stack them carefully with chipper blades distributed evenly around the outer blades. This will help prevent excessive vibration. Make sure all the teeth are oriented in the proper direction of rotation. Chipper blades must have their teeth placed in the gullet of the outer blades so they'll stack up properly. Try to tighten the blades consistently each time they're mounted, since this can alter the thickness of the cut slightly. If your saw permits the use of the saw guard during dado cuts, reinstall the guard. If the guard will remain off during dado work, be extra careful and increase the margin of safety. When you're ready to make the cut, hold the stock firmly against the miter. We have clamped a stop on the table to position the stock properly. Remember to maintain an extra margin of safety when cutting with dado blades. Slowly push the miter gauge across the table. Cutting with a dado blade can cause more of a problem with kickbacks, since there are more teeth cutting out a larger volume of material. It might be safer to remove a small amount at a time and get the full depth cut with successive passes. 3/8 inches is about the deepest amount you can remove in one pass. By removing a little at a time, you can just about eliminate tear out. Some shops only allow dado work to be done on the radial arm saw. Either way, it will take lots of practice and test cuts to become proficient at doing precision dado cuts. Before we close this program, let's take a minute to review the basic safety rules for operating the table saw. Remember, in most shops, you must get the supervisor's or instructor's permission before using the table saw. The other basic safety rules are: keep the guard and splitter in place, Use the proper blade for each job. Adjust the height and angle before each operation. Secure all clamps and locks. Use the fence and miter gauge properly. Inspect your stock before you begin cutting. Position yourself properly. Wear the proper clothing and safety gear. Maintain a 4-inch safety margin at all times. Make sure the blade is clear before starting the saw. Anticipate and prevent kickbacks. Always keep your body away from the rotating blade. Never leave the saw while it's running. Maintain a clean work area. And lower the blade when you're done. The table saw can become a very important tool for all your woodshop projects, but it'll take time and lots of practice for you to become confident. Take the time to think through each operation and ask for help if you have any doubts. The results will be worth your effort. Until next time, have a safe and productive woodworking session.